Muchas gracias por la presencia de todos. Y decía que creo que es todavía temprano para especular sobre todas las consecuencias políticas y económicas de la pandemia del coronavirus. No sabemos ni cuándo ni cómo acabará la pandemia, pero hay algunas cosas que sabemos. Sabemos que vivimos probablemente la crisis más grave en el orden mundial después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial y que esta crisis supone un desafío radical al sistema político democrático, al estado del bienestar, a la economía, por lo que nuestra principal tarea, la de los liberales democráticos, es salvaguardar los principios del orden internacional liberal, de nuestras democracias liberales. También sabemos que vamos a vivir, como ocurre después de todas estas grandes tragedias, como es una guerra, como es una pandemia, unos momentos de aceleración histórica que van a producir resultados inciertos, pero que van a producir una nueva realidad estratégica en el mundo, con vencedores y perdedores. Como siempre, la Fundación FAES ha querido contribuir a este importante debate. Esta semana hablaremos de Europa, nos centraremos en Europa, pero creo que centrarnos en las cuestiones europeas es muy necesario para subrayar algunas de las consecuencias de la pandemia que especialmente afectan y afectarán a Europa. Y yo me centraré en algunas que están, en mi opinión, entre las más importantes. La primera es que estamos en una pandemia con un problema de carácter global, que no ha tenido una respuesta global, lo cual supone una segunda consideración. Y es que en buena parte las instituciones multilaterales derivadas del orden creado después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial no han funcionado correctamente. Y la pregunta es, ¿por qué no funcionan esas instituciones multilaterales? Algunas razones radican en el hecho de que no tienen mecanismos y competencias adecuadas para gestionar una pandemia. Pero la razón principal probablemente esté en la falta de liderazgo. Creo sinceramente que el único país que ha podido liderar una respuesta global a la pandemia, los Estados Unidos, ha renunciado a ese papel. En consecuencia, en mi opinión, tenemos que reinventar el multilateralismo. Necesitamos un multilateralismo renovado, que es muy difícil o imposible de imaginar sin el liderazgo de los Estados Unidos. Pero está claro que en él la Unión Europea debe tener un papel distinto, mayor en esa gran tarea, si no quiere quedarse irreversiblemente atrás. En tercer lugar, sin duda vamos a ver como consecuencia de la crisis en la que estábamos ya, ahora acentuada, una grave controversia en aquellos que quieren presentar los regímenes autoritarios, los regímenes populistas, incluso las dictaduras totalitarias, como una solución a lo que significan las democracias liberales o los países y las sociedades libres y abiertas. Los países totalitarios nunca van a ser ejemplo para la resolución de los problemas. La tentación totalitaria siempre ha estado presente en Europa y hoy también esa tentación es un pulso, esa amenaza es algo que los demócratas tenemos que ganar. No se puede pasar por alto que al mismo tiempo que hay que abordar esta pandemia, Europa, cuando debe afrontar sus propios factores de inestabilidad, la Unión se encuentra en un entorno internacional en sí mismo muy inestable, con tendencias desintegradoras, caóticas si se quiere, rodeado de potencias asertivas con pretensiones regionales, como es el caso de Turquía, o más globales, como es el caso de Rusia, o totalmente global, como es el caso de China, lo que exige respuestas frente a las estrategias de confrontación, de influencia ilegítima y de interferencia. Y por último, no lo menos importante, sino tal vez lo más relevante, es que el gran desafío, la gran confrontación entre Estados Unidos y China obligará a un replanteamiento general estratégico de la situación en el mundo y obligará, por tanto, también a la Unión Europea a tomar decisiones trascendentales desde el punto de vista político, económico, de innovación, de lo que desea ser su posición en el mundo. Pues bien, en esta introducción, que deseo que sea breve y va a ser breve, quiero también hacer una referencia a nuestro país, a España. Europa nos importa mucho. Estar en Europa con nuestros socios es para nosotros esencial. Yo considero que la Unión Europea es más imprescindible hoy que nunca. Contar con el peso económico de la Unión para facilitar la recuperación es indispensable. Pero la Unión no espera que nosotros deleguemos en ellos la solución de nuestros problemas. Por importante que sea el esfuerzo financiero que haga la Unión, nos corresponde a nosotros retomar una tarea de reformas profundas de nuestro sistema productivo, de nuestro sistema educativo, de nuestros modelos de trabajo y ocupación, que están cambiando de manera vertiginosa. Debemos plantear nuevos terrenos de colaboración público-privada y en ello la sociedad civil tiene que ocupar un espacio indispensable. Tenemos ante nosotros la necesidad imperiosa de fortalecer nuestras instituciones, de fortalecer un Estado complejo que antes que recrearse en el narcisismo de la identidad local, sepa que está para servir a los ciudadanos y que sepa y entiendan los ciudadanos que de la desintegración no conseguirán nada positivo. Cuando aparece el COVID, España aún se estaba recuperando de una recesión profunda que descargó buena parte de sus peores efectos sobre las clases medias y las expectativas de nuestros jóvenes. En vez de continuar con el esfuerzo para equilibrar las finanzas públicas y seguir recuperando los elementos de estabilidad, desgraciadamente se abandonaron esos objetivos por un gobierno dogmático que entiende la política como simple propaganda, como simple instrumento populista y el poder como un instrumento de ventaja partidista. El resultado es una política excéntrica en la que opciones muy minoritarias y nada comprometidas con el interés general de España recaban un poder de decisión absolutamente desproporcionado. Quiero decir que, en mi opinión, es como poco lamentable que el Gobierno de España en su momento más difícil se apoye en esa agrupación excéntrica de partidos y que además es lamentable que este estado en que se encuentra la política española se haya llegado a ver por algunos incluso como un fenómeno de renovación saludable. Quiero concluir afirmando mi convicción de que sin un gobierno solvente, sin un proyecto fuerte, sin un gobierno cuya fortaleza no radique en las limitaciones de la aritmética parlamentaria, sino precisamente en la solidez y credibilidad de un fuerte proyecto, nuestro país tendrá plaza en el vagón de cola de Europa por mucho tiempo y con malas consecuencias. La razón es sencilla. Mientras otros países son capaces de ir resolviendo los problemas que son comunes a todos, una fórmula de gobierno disfuncional y contradictoria, como la que padecemos, sin un sentido de compromiso nacional compartido, hace que España, en vez de afrontar con todos los problemas comunes, se instale en sus problemas diferenciales y los agrave. Y no tiene por qué ser así. Dicho de otro modo, aquellos países, aquellas naciones en las que las disputas domésticas prevalezcan sobre qué es la atención a la evolución de las tendencias generales en el mundo que viene, serán irreversiblemente perdedoras. Precisamente para ello queremos que debates como estos nos ayuden no solo a conocer y diagnosticar los problemas, sino a vislumbrar soluciones y caminos de avance. Y finalmente quiero agradecer muy sinceramente a todos los que van a participar en las diversas mesas su disposición a intervenir. Pocas veces puede verse reunidos y escuchar a un grupo de tan alta cualificación para hablar de los diversos temas propuestos. Estoy convencido de que estas jornadas cumplirán sobradamente con lo que debemos esperar del diálogo y el debate fundado sobre lo que nos preocupa. Una vez más, muchas gracias a todos.
Muchas gracias, presidente. Thank you, President, and thank you for your remarks, which are a good kickoff for the seminar, for the discussion we are going to have now. So as far as I'm concerned, the only thing that is left to me now is respectfully give the floor to Ana Palacio to start this conversation that we are all eager to listen to. So Ana, please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And even if time is a scarce commodity always, and for us today, administering 45 minutes is really a tour de force, allow me to say big thanks to FAES, to Prime Minister Aznar, but in particular to you, and as director of FAES, not as MEP, but as director of FAES, and to Mira Milosevic, as director of this series of timely, just conversations. I will call them conversations. And without any further ado, I will say that neither Joe Weiler nor Jean-François Bellamy need any presentation. I mean, you all know them. Joe Weiler, I will just say that he is the maître à penser, el maestro de muchas generaciones de europeos. Un pensador a quien seguimos, yo la primera, yo soy el número uno de su club de fans. Jean-François Bellamy fue una de las grandes sorpresas de las últimas elecciones. Jean-François, I just will switch back into English as I would say as a lingua franca, although you have to learn Spanish, frankly, Jean-François, you have to learn Spanish, but from Jean-François, as I said, was a surprise. He headed the list of Les Républicains and now is just giving surprises to many in his position as MEP, but he comes from the philosophy world. And I think that it is important, this meta vision. Now, some housekeeping, because housekeeping is important. We will speak for about 30 minutes and then bring in questions. If you send the questions before and I can bring them before that, I will do that. You can submit your questions via the questions and answer of the box chat function. And just allow me to just a few words of introduction. As Prime Minister Aznar has said, although Europe, meaning the European Union, and maybe we will discuss European Union, where are we? But European construction has always been perceived as muddling through and surviving, just in a way of reinterpreting this Monnet's dictum of Europe will be made from crisis to crisis. But this was a different crisis, and I fully agree with Prime Minister Aznar. I think that this crisis, among many other things, was a catalyzer of processes that he has mentioned, and I will just focus on Europe in this process. I think that we have clearly a reaction towards globalization that has pushed regaining sovereignty. We are in an intergovernmental moment in the Union, or maybe this is one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves. Are we in an intergovernmental moment? And if yes, what does this mean? The second is the role of big government. We see this in many of what has been happening. And frankly, my third issue would be the relationship between state and the citizen and the impact for the European social fabric. Because as Prime Minister has said, what is at stake is the normative supremacy of liberal democracy. Not more, not less, but really not less. And for a construction that is a construction in law and by law, this has consequences. So with this context in mind, I would ask both of you first to give a certain context. For you, and allow me to ask you, Professor Joseph Weiler, for the number one card holder of your club of fans, Joe Weiler, what would be, it's true that we cannot speak about post-pandemia Europe, but there are certain trends. For you, what are the best and the worst of what has been happening during, or has been just the consequence of this pandemia crisis? Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. If you look at the half full part of the glass,
you have a problem with your Wi-Fi. Joe, I mean, your voice come hashed out. I think, François, from your perspective, what you would highlight, 5 takeaways or 6 takeaways, positive and negative, about how the pandemic has been just confronted by Europe, and maybe this introduction of the European Union?
Thank you so much, dear Anna. I'm very happy to share this moment with you and with my dear colleague Javier in the European Parliament. I see we are in the same place now. It's a great honor to be with you today, and I was very happy to listen to Prime Minister Aznar because I so much share the concerns he expressed before. I'm sorry I can't speak Spanish well enough to talk to you in your language today, but I'm look forward to hearing to Professor Weiler in a moment.
I apologize,
I don't know if the
technical
connection
problems.
is better.
Shall I continue?
Shall I continue? Or
Yeah,
Professor
okay.
Weiler?
Well, then let's go back to Joe. This is the fantastic things of cyberspace, is that you can go back and forth. So, Joe, back to you.
These terrible American platforms. So intergovernmental Europe functioned more or less as usual. There's a crisis. It seems that one cannot resolve it, but eventually a compromise is reached. A little bit too much for some, a little bit too little for others, but it works, it's functional. That's the first positive takeaway. And the second is that very often crisis produces progress. Even one year ago, nobody would have imagined the particular solution with the European Union assuming massive debt in order to help come out of the crisis. And it is the crisis that produced that. The negative is that, and I will be a little bit polemical, I will exaggerate, but with more than a grain of truth, we saw the failure of the citizenship project. One respect in which the citizen project failed, one really did not sense solidarity. Solidarity is one aspect of citizenship which is fundamental. And if we think of the frugal state, so to speak, or even Germany, one did not feel that the Dutch and the Finns and the Germans, etc., really had solidarity with Spain and Italy, the countries most affected by COVID. They were not acting. Their leaders were representing more or less public opinion. They were not acting with solidarity or feeling solidarity towards their so-called fellow European citizens. Now, the President Aznar is absolutely right. The most important thing is to protect and defend liberal democracy. But the European Union itself still suffers from a profound democracy deficit. The citizens of Europe do not get to elect their European leaders. And the votes of European citizens to the European Parliament voter preference does not translate into policy of the Union. And as that is one thing. And the second thing, and I have to insist on that, it's like my Cato's cry. it's the absence of direct European taxation. Direct European taxation is not only important because then it's European money that is being spent in Spain or Italy, wherever, and not money that the Germans give or the Dutch give or the French give, etc. It's European money. But secondly, taxation is an instrument of democracy as important as voting. Taxation creates accountability, creates responsibility. Citizens feel, what are you doing with my money? And my view is until there's some profound institutional change in the way European democracy functions, and until we have the courage to institute direct European taxation, these structural problems will be with us also at the next crisis.
Well, that's a launching pad, and as a dyed-in-the-wool Europeanist, and this is Javier Zarzalejos has introduced me, and I think that, I always express that I went into politics because of Europe. But honestly, Joe, and this is the segue to Jean-François Bellamy that just had time to say thanks. You say that there has been an intergovernmental good response, and you mentioned the recovery fund, and then you switch into just a big ambition of changing the treaties, of addressing the European demos. If we are meant to bring this solidarity to its full consequences and to have a common translation, and this is what you explained about the citizenship project. Now, my question to you, Jean-François, is what's your perspective? How do you see these two? There is a hinge there. Intergovernmentalism, the hinge is the treaty, and then the ambition. How do you see that from being in the European Parliament? By the way, let me open a parenthesis here. Are you going to vote swiftly for the recovery fund, or is the European Parliament going to play, flexing muscles with the multi-annual just budget? And this is a provocation, of course.
Yes, that's a true question. Thank you so much. So I'd like to start on what has been just said by Professor Weiler. I fully agree with some points made, but I would also express some dissentiments. First of all, this was a COVID crisis, and as all crises, it has revealed what was Europe and the problems that Europe had to face. A crisis is always a moment of truth. And what did we see? We see Europe unable to face a sanitary crisis, unable to give people the things and the very basic assets that they needed to face this sanitary emergency. We had to go to China to ask for the remains of the goods that were produced there for our citizens. And yes, we didn't see solidarity, but how can you express solidarity when you don't have even the basic needs to give to your own citizens? Between European countries, there were very tough fights. We all know it. And I'm very sorry as a French, because I remember this very tough time when the French government stopped some medical emergency products at the border between France and Spain. I was ashamed for it. But at the same time, how could we have experienced a different situation when we didn't have the means to produce what we needed? So in fact, I totally share what Prime Minister Aznar said just before. And I would say, for what he said about Spain, the same thing about France and about Europe as a whole. In fact, we don't see that we are playing in a global game, and that this global game obliges us to have a global view on the matters we have to face. We are too much concentrated on internal problems of a very short scale perspective, without any vision of the very important challenges that we have to face in the new multilateralism scheme that is designing under our eyes. My view is that this is a moment for Europe to stop producing rules and start having strategies, to stop creating new constraints and try to have a new vision for the future and invest in common strategies for the years to come. It will be, of course, necessary in health, and everybody sees it now, but the next crisis will not resemble the past one. We all know it. The next crisis could be on the food supply, it could be on security issues, it could be on defense matters, and so we need to be prepared in all strategic fields, especially, for example, when it comes about digitalization, data management, data processing, because this is a condition of our freedom for tomorrow. And as you said, Prime Minister Aznar, of course, and this is a very important responsibility of our moment for the future, we have to save the very ideal of liberal democracy and the very possibility of democracy for the future. So that would be my first remark, and I see it especially when it comes about ecology and climate change. Of course, we need to make efforts to face climate change. Of course, we need to change what has to be changed in our way of living, our way of producing. This is, by all evidence, crucial. But we all know that this is a global issue and that we won't solve it by local solutions. We have to make and to start making a priority of it in the internal conversation by using strengths, lever of strengths with other parts of the world. And for example, the internal market should be the first priority. The internal market is now very easily accessible from everywhere in the world. We should make it a condition for a lever on the ecological transition by, for example, starting to implement this carbon adjustment mechanism that will give back some oxygen to our industries, but at the same time push other parts of the world to address also this question of climate change. But this would mean a total disruption in the way Europe, as I see it from the beginning of this short mandate, in the way Europe sees the rest of the world and its own role in the rest of the world. I would like to conclude this first remarks by a word on this question of democracy. Today, democracy is in danger, in crisis, because people do not feel that they are given by the state a solution to write their own history. They have the impression not to be able to change anything. And this, in fact, is taking away the very meaning of voting and participating in the public debate. This is a reason why citizenship is collapsing in countries like ours, especially among the young voters that do not feel concerned about what is happening in the political landscape. So we need to give back people again the possibility to decide and to experience their capacity of decision. And I have to say that Europe has been one of the symptoms of this incapacity to decide. And Europe means for citizens, for example, in France, something that is against their democratic power. We need to face this question. We won't be able to solve it only by explaining people that Europe is a good project. We need to build a European Union that receives again the trust of the citizens. And the trust of the citizens cannot be obtained only by arguments. It must be obtained by experience. So building a Europe that is in a way able to answer the demands of the citizens. This is the reason why I would fear a lot the idea of a Europe that would see itself as a super state. I don't think that it could work. Why? Because Europe doesn't have the scheme of an empire. If there is a question of demos in Europe, it is because there is no European demos. We have many European people and many European people with culture, historical references, historical rituals and habits that are not the same. And even the language, and we are experiencing today this question of difference of language, is also a condition for the democratic debate. European ideal is, I believe it very much, more necessary than ever, of course. But this ideal is not the ideal of building a unique empire. It's the ideal of alliance of nations, sovereign democracies, building a democratic space and preserving their democratic sovereignty by the way that they build common strategies in a global world, in a world of global powers. This doesn't imply that Europe takes itself for the states or try to replace nation states. And it is the case, I mean, and I finish by it, when we start to think about common borrowing, common financing by a loan, a common loan of this European recovery plan, when we, as we know, do not have the single idea of the way we are going to repay this borrowing. And this is a problem in the way that we didn't agree on what implied this common loan. I think that it could become one of the symptoms, one more symptom of the democratic crisis if we don't face this issue. I think that we shouldn't try to use a crisis situation to enter in a logics that European citizens many times say they didn't want to be seen. So we need maybe to revive European ideal and European spirit by giving back to Europe its very foundations, making people feel at home in Europe and able to decide for their future, and do not try to take Europe for what doesn't correspond to its very precise spirit and scheme. Thank you again for this conversation. Sorry, Anna, I think we don't hear you because you're muted. Sorry. Anna, I'm sorry.
Anna, microphone. Anna, microphone.
Hi. Well, François Xavier, I was saying that if you were in plenary in the European Parliament, you would have had trouble, because, I mean, this is a dialogue. This is questions and responses. I hope that your very interesting perspective, which is fantastic, will have a session, one session. But today, as we agreed, questions, answers that are, I would say, more concentrated. Joe, I go back to you, and of course, I think it's turno de réplica. Of course, this is turno de réplica, but I will ask you as well to just, we are speaking about European Union. The question is clear. We are not speaking about Europe, but European Union, and there are differences. But I would like you to give us the context. So what is the European Union in the world? We have seen François Xavier that just has brought us to this idea of sovereignty, sovereign states. But, okay, well then, of course, European Union is not an empire. We know that. By the way, European Union is a legal construction. So, you know, rules for us. Of course, we need strategy. What we need is political will. But your turn, Joe, with a perspective, because time flies, with a perspective from the world, from what is our context? What is our geographic context?
Thank you. So, President Aznar, I will just change. I will try and say what he said with slightly different words. The Pax Americana is over. And it's not only because of Trump. The Pax Americana was over already before Trump. So something that really was part of our world from 1914 till 2014 is over. So what role for Europe in a world without the Pax Americana? You will recall that during the Cold War, there was the group of non-aligned countries that did not align either with the West nor with the Soviet Empire. And I think there's space now, because we're in a kind of Cold War, although without the same menace of total destruction, but we are in a kind of Cold War where the poles are the United States, China, and to some extent Russia still. And I think there's place for the world for a new non-aligned grouping for which Europe would be the leader. In other words, you maintain as best as one can good relations with the United States. It pays nobody to create confrontation, but there are red lines that the European Union has to draw. And it, in my view, would be the natural leader of a non-aligned group which believes in multilateralism, which would position itself between the United States and China and this kind of trade bellicosity that we are now seeing. And it corresponds to European values, it corresponds to European ideals, and Europe is the only bloc that can really lead such a realignment of global politics. So we will have the United States, we will have China, and then there would be Europe together with partners, ASEAN, from Asia, from Latin America, from Africa, who would welcome this kind of leadership and position themselves between those two poles. Anna, your microphone.
I was saying, I mean, I'm sorry, I would love to be a panelist and not a moderator, because a moderator is just a referee. So, not Jean-François, you know, Jean-François, for me, Jean-François Revel. And I think that it will not be bad for you that in my mind, I switched to Jean-François. It's François Xavier Bellamy, by the way, like Javier Zarzalejos. It's exactly the same name that Javier Zarzalejos. So, back to you. How do you agree of this? In a way, this is soft power in a different context. Soft power when the European Union was just projecting soft power was a bit, you know, a kind of just getting a free ride on NATO and on the nukes during the Cold War, on the nukes of the United States. Is this the time, contrary to what we see, is this the time to claim that there is a fantastic moment for the European Union to be standard bearers of this idea of rule of law, of just being the mediator? François Xavier.
Of course, I fully agree with what Professor Weiler has just said. I think that this is not only an opportunity for Europe, it is a responsibility for Europe, because we need to give to the world of tomorrow the equilibrium it needs, and not to be trapped into the confrontation of superpowers. But it will not need only soft power to be achieved, it needs real power. And I mean, it's the question of, do Europeans today want to build the conditions of their common action in the world of tomorrow? And this implies, for example, to define what would be strategic autonomy in the world of tomorrow. What means exactly resilience? How we can try to define the ways that we will be able to face the crisis and the shocks of tomorrow. And if we are not ready to do this work, then we will be in the dependency of another power, and it cannot be otherwise. So the question is, do we want to afford the conditions of this power? I think that we need to, because it's a responsibility, as I said, towards the world of tomorrow. For example, on the question of security and defense, are we ready to invest in common? Not, for example, in a European army. You will have understood that it would not be my idea, because it would not correspond to a real political, democratic, direct structure. But, for example, in our defense industry, in our common defense industry, for example, the European Defense Fund would be a concrete embodiment of this idea of a new equilibrium that Europe can offer to the world of tomorrow. And I would say it also in other strategic fields that I quoted just before. But I fully agree with what Professor Weiler said. This is a priority for Europe today.
Joe, may just take this as a stepping stone to remember that you have insisted many times that one of the problems of the European Constitution, the ill-fated European Constitution, was that it listed rights but not duties, and I think that this is an important point that we need. If you say responsibility, you mentioned this before, but I mean, how can we address this deep sense of entitlement that the citizens in Europe, the European citizens as well, just feel today, and how does this just make its way in what you were saying and what François Xavier is saying?
Well, the problem of a culture which is only of rights and entitlements and not duty and responsibility is a problem not only of the European Union, it's a problem of the member states. There's no European politician today who could go before his or her people and say, don't ask what the state can do for you. Like Kennedy said in 1960, ask what you can do for your state. The only politicians which have that message, and they are very clever, are the leaders of the populist parties. They do not shy away from talking about patriotism and the duty of the citizen towards the state and towards society. And you see that it has a great appeal. So what has to be done, Anna? It's for our leaders to face directly this problem and not to shy away. You don't enlist confidence and democracy by bread and circus. Citizens have to feel that it's also their responsibility, that if it's a problem, it's not just the state and public power that has to give solutions. And the only way to confront it is to confront it and to change the narrative of our politics to a narrative which combines rights and entitlements, of course, but combines it also with duties and responsibilities. So that's how you confront it. You confront it by confronting it.
In the end, we go back to what...
Excuse me, I just want to add.
Oh, sorry.
Because both François Xavier and I, each one, and together we are challenging two taboos. One taboo that I challenged was, we have to speak about European taxation. How can you be a citizen in a polity and not pay taxes directly to fund this polity? And François Xavier, in a very soft way, said, Europe has to take responsibility for its security. How can you be a polity which is not responsible for security and again relies on the cavalry from across the Atlantic for its security? So one just has to confront these problems by confronting them and changing the narrative and not being afraid to change the narrative.
This would bring me to a question that I think that for the European citizens is not any longer clear. European Union, what for? And I think that this crisis may be a good starting point to go into what you are saying, because the European Union, I mean, the European construction or the European project was for peace. And this is very clear. It was for peace. But then it just morphed into being for prosperity. But the moment that the project doesn't obviously give you prosperity, and after the crisis in 2008, 2010, we saw that, what is Europe for? And what are the underpinnings of this European Union? Both of you have spoken about values, have written. You, François Xavier, you insist a lot on this issue. So, okay, we need to shake up the citizens and bring responsibilities. But what is the meta responsibilities? Based on what?
Look, I can give you the way you pose the question is part of the problem. Have you ever asked what is Spain for? Has an Italian politician ever asked his citizens or her citizen, what is Italy for? We've passed the stage where we have to keep justifying what Europe is for, a utilitarian justification. It's self-destructive, because if they think it's good for me, I support it. And the minute it's not good for me, I reject it. Forget it. We are a community of fate. We are destined to live each other in interdependence. So we stop asking, what is it for? It is, we are Europeans. And the question is, what are we going to do with it? The minute you ask, what is it for? You invite people to say, well, I don't like that, so forget about Europe. We've passed that stage. That is 20, 30 years ago.
Well,
and Brexit has proved that.
Joe, this is great. This is the debate that I wanted. And frankly, next time I don't want to be the moderator, because of course I have to launch ideas that are not, and that I would love to repeal. So, François Xavier, what's your perspective on this?
But please, Anna, we would be most interested to know also your perspective. Do not hesitate to intervene. My personal view would be agree and disagree at the same time, if I may. In a way, what you said is true for Europe. It is not so true for the European Union, which is totally different, in fact. Europe is a 2,000 years civilization, and yes, in this sense, we are Europeans, and I share what you say. The question is, what do we have to do with it today? This is the basis of our responsibility, and this is the reason why we need to give a meaning to the European Union, which is a construction, a project, and as any project, it is a human structure that needs to find its utility in a way. And it's normal that people ask us what it is all about. And in this way, as I said, with my dear colleague Javier, and I know that Isabel Benjumea, one of our colleagues, is also with us right now. What I felt very strange in the beginning of the mandate is that European Union is always trying to communicate more. And of course, this is important, but we also need to trust what people say to us. And when they do not understand, it is not only because European Union did not communicate well enough. It's also because European Union failed on some very important issues. I know that Prime Minister Aznar achieved very important reforms that gave Spain prosperity while entering the European Common Monetary Union. The question is, how do we revive also this European efficiency while serving the people in the sense of prosperity and fairness? And this is questions that we have to reply about, which we can't just reply that Europe is a fact and that people have to live with it. We have to give back a meaning to European Union, and this will not be only by a better communication. This should be by listening in a very democratic spirit to what people say to us about the failures of EU today.
Well, thank you. There are several questions from the audience, but there is one that it's very provocative. Therefore, as a moderator, I love it. How can you just bring together what you are saying, or with the idea of entitlement that COVID has exacerbated in a certain state, in a sense, due to the welfare state? And by the way, there is a nota bene. The European Union had no competencies, no powers in the area of health, which is absolutely true. But this maybe Joe, this is for you. I mean, do you think that COVID will exacerbate the entitlement perspective of the citizens or not? Or do you think that this is not the question?
Just as I don't know anybody who wants Europe to be an empire or state, I don't know any serious politician in Europe that wants to totally dismantle the welfare state. So this is part of our cultural baggage. We can refine it, we can modify it, etc. But the normal expectation of solidarity through the welfare state is something that Europeans legitimately have come to expect. So COVID makes it more acute, and yet it is a test. I don't think that will exacerbate the culture of entitlement. The culture of entitlement in and of itself is what it is. It's the absence of a culture of duty and responsibility, which I was talking about before, to go hand in hand with entitlement rights, but also duties. And I already mentioned how I thought one can address it. For example, for the third time, my Cato's cry, to think seriously for many reasons about Europe's own resources. You know, when you have a crisis in the United States, you have the same kind of debates. moral hazard? Should we help them? Should we let them go to the wall? But I've never heard in the United States that somebody in California said, why should I give Californian money to Florida? Or why should I give Texas money to Massachusetts? And the reason is not because they are better citizens, etc., because it's not California money. It's not Massachusetts money. It's American money. It's federal money. And Europe has to be in that position.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And there are several questions, and unfortunately, we won't be able to address all of them. So FAES make a second part of this dialogue. But this is an interesting question. Given the difficulties of treaty change, leaders could be forced to pursue creative ways of pushing EU objectives and policy goals, including the so-called backdoor integration. Of course, this is constitutional, but as an MEP, what would you say? And we are 3 minutes or 4 minutes to go.
In 30 seconds, I'd say that yes, I think that we can have very creative approach of Europe and European Union functioning today. This is a question that we would have to share also with our colleagues, but in the EPP group today, we are trying to think about the future of European Union and try to explore everything we could do inside the treaties now. The treaties are not preventing us to develop efficient strategies for the future, and they should not be a blocking problem to continue to work together and to revive this European spirit.
Since I believe in the rule of law, and the law now is that we have to finish in 3 minutes, now I will say what François Xavier said. I agree with everything he just said.
Well, that's great. And this is a fantastic way to just bring this panel to a closure, just by saying that this is to be followed, to be pursued. And I hope that FAES will do that. We are sharp on time. I'm sorry for those that have brought questions forward to the chat that we haven't had time to discuss them. But if I'm participating or moderating in the second part of this discussion, I will make sure that we address them. Thank you. Back to you, Mira, and Javier Carzalejos.
Thank you, Anna. And thanks, Joseph Weiler and François Xavier. I take your idea, so this is not the end, this is to be continued. And you will be one of our contributors where you are going to get rid of this role of moderator and to have a free reign on your ideas on the European Union. I think we have had a wonderful debate with the right balance between agreement and disagreement, and very provocative ideas in some areas that have stirred up the debate. And that is what this kind of discussions is expected to do in the audience. So Anna, thank you very much. You have led the discussion with your usual mastery, and we thank the participants for the valuable contribution. It's really, as I said before, a privilege to hear them here. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Do consul.
Muy bien. Judith.
Buenos días, presidente. Ya se dio el nombramiento de los directores de las APIs en los puertos del país. El nombramiento del almirante Rommel Ledesma llamó mucho la atención en Veracruz, sobre todo porque se tiene la percepción de que la administración del puerto pues está en manos de la iniciativa privada. En este sentido, al ya tener el nombramiento por parte de un miembro de la Marina, ¿dará marcha atrás a la revisión que usted está realizando para saber qué pasa con lo de la concesión por 100 años a empresas extranjeras? Y si también